Well, let's get this started. Um, Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Sonoma State University and the Sonoma State University Alumni Association, thank you so much for joining us online this evening for the 2025 Outlook on Politics and Economics, the Road Ahead webinar featuring Dr. Rob Eyler and Dr. David McCuan. We're excited to have you with us this evening. My name is Tiffany O'Neill, and I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni Relations and University Engagement. Tonight, we're thrilled to have so many Sonoma State alumni, students, faculty, staff, and community members all joining us online for this engaging discussion. Before we start, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. Tonight's session is being recorded, and we will be sending it to all registered attendees later this week, so be on the lookout for that. If you have questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. Questions will be monitored and answered throughout the conversation. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mario Perez, our Vice President for University Advancement at Sonoma State, who will introduce our speakers and give our land acknowledgement tonight. Thank you for being here, and we hope you enjoy the webinar. Mario.
Thank you, Tiffany, and welcome everybody. First and foremost, I would like to do a land acknowledgement and recognize that Sonoma State University sits on the borderlands of the Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok nations, the descendants of whom today are the enrolled citizens of the Federated Indians of the Great Rancheria. The mission of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria is social justice and environmental stewardship. The tribe hopes and encourages the larger community to join them in this necessary mission. So we are very fortunate to have amazing experts on faculty here at Sonoma State, and more specifically, experts in domestic and international geopolitical events who sit on our faculty, and two of them are with us tonight. I'm excited to introduce to you two of our stellar faculty members and our speaker for this evening's presentation, Dr. Rob Eyler and Dr. David McCuan. Dr. Eyler is a professor of economics here at Sonoma State, where he has been teaching since 1995. He earned a PhD from the University of California, Davis in 1998. His educational journey began at CSU Chico, where he earned a BA in economics in 1992. Dr. Eyler is the author of two books and numerous academic articles concerning economic sanctions, the economics of the wine industry, and monetary economics. He is often called upon by media for his expert input into the economic climate, and he has acted as an expert witness on interstate trade litigation as a forensic economist. Dr. Eyler has been a visiting scholar at both the University of Bologna and Stanford University. He is native to Sonoma County, California, and his roots run deep here in the North Bay, as his family has been ranchers in Marin and Sonoma counties since 1910. And Dr. McCuan is a professor of political science here at Sonoma State University. His scholarly expertise rests in two broad areas: American politics and international relations. His doctorate was granted from the University of California, Riverside in 2002. And Professor McCuan also focuses on terrorism and political violence. Due to his expertise and adherence to a policy of strict bipartisanship, his commentary analysis sought out by multiple media outlets and includes media appearances providing analysis of campaign dynamics and election results among international, national, regional, and local media outlets. In fact, we were just chatting about it. I saw him the other night on TV. I would like to add that Dr. McCuan is a proud Sonoma State graduate, and both our speakers tonight are both CSU alumni. Both of these fabulous faculty members here at Sonoma State were made in the CSU. I thank each of you for joining us tonight, and I want to give a little shout out to Tiffany and Amy for putting this together. They've done a fantastic job working with Dr. Eyler in putting these programs together. So thank you. And Rob, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Mario, and thank you to Tiffany and the staff there at in Advancement and in Alumni Association here at Sonoma State. And thanks everybody for making the time tonight to hear what David and I have to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start us off with a look at the macroeconomy and also thinking about more regionally what's been happening and how the road ahead may change some of the forecasts that are out there for not only the national economy, but also the North Bay, and also some of the things we should not get too overblown about in terms of where the economy may be going. And there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, while there's always a lot of uncertainty in the economy, we just don't know what's going to happen after January 20 with certainty. And thus there's this extra layer of concern. And financial markets have shown a little bit of that in some ways, shapes, and forms, which tells you investors are starting to think about where the road ahead is going also. But let's start with the labor market. So what I like to do right off the top is compare the Great Recession, or the period between November 2007 and basically the recovery of the jobs that were lost in what we call the Great Recession, to what happened during the pandemic. If we make the total number of people working in the United States equal to 100 in November 2007, it took 78 months to get that same number of people working again in the United States. So this is why we call the Great Recession the Great Recession. The pandemic recession was triggered by a much sharper cut and then a little faster comeback. And so when that black line crosses the red dotted line, we basically have got back the same number of jobs we had in January 2020 after seasonal adjustments. And that 104.8 number on the far right-hand side of the screen suggests we're 4.8% above the number of people working in the United States we were in January 2020. So you have this sort of recession, recovery, and expansion period, which has all happened since January 2020. Now, why I'm showing you this is because we will not have a declared recession again in the United States unless that black line starts to fade toward the red dotted line. So as I'm talking about the forecast in just a minute, keep that in mind, that we really need to see job losses to start to generate the conditions under which we would actually have a declared second recession from the pandemic recession. The focus of the Federal Reserve is going to be on prices, and they have a very special price index in mind when they think about interest rates, and it's called the Core Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. And what that really means is that if you take everything you buy at home and you pull out food and energy products and services, you turn that basket of stuff you buy every month into a core basket of consumption. The price of that basket and its percentage change from 12 months ago is illustrated by the blue solid line on this graph. The blue dotted line is where the Federal Reserve basically wants to see the economy weave that blue solid line around on a regular basis, which basically does two things. One, it suggests that inflation is relatively predictable, and two is that it's relatively stable. Now, you can see that for most of the period between January 2007, which is the start of this graph, there's a relatively large shaded area on the far left-hand side. That's the Great Recession period. Prices fell and then remained relatively stable for the 2010s. And then you can see after the skinny shaded area, about 2/3 of the way moving left to right, we saw a real spike in these data, and that was the inflation period we've been through. And now we've seen that inflation period subside. The current forecast for where we're going as of December 2024 is this through, let's say, the end of 2027. So those red dots represent not only the pathway, but the bands around them. That gray bands are the error around those forecasts, which tells you a large story about the uncertainty that's been sprung up now in 2026 or through the end of 2025, I'm sorry. And the idea is to move that blue solid line through those red dots as best as possible by shaping interest rates through monetary policy. Now, the things to consider, and this is what kind of the 10,000 foot level question that monetary policy and monetary economists are asking each other is, where should the path go and how dependent should it be on inflation? So one of the biggest things, and I'll come back in about 7 minutes and say this, is that in terms of the uncertainty with the Trump administration is, will their policies be inflationary? Or will they be relatively static in terms of the effects on prices at the end of the day? And there are people on both sides of this argument. I'll try to make an argument that is relatively well-founded in economics, that if tariffs are generalized, we need to recognize there's going to be a lift of prices. How high that lift will be against other countervailing forces is the big question of the hour, but I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. The idea is we're already seeing prices rise a little bit, with the idea that expectations drive a lot of activity inside of inflation. So when you're setting prices, you're thinking about where you've been and where you're going. And if you think you're going into an inflationary period, you're thinking, boy, I better start slowly rising prices now so I don't shock the market when it's really time to take advantage or take into account my increasing costs. And you're seeing a little bit of this sort of bottoming out activity. This has got a lot of people nervous, as I'll talk about in a minute, about the pathway of interest rates from here, because inflation, while it's descended from relatively high heights, it is not necessarily showing a consistent movement down over, let's say, the last 6 or 8 months, what's inside of that circle. Now, a fun graph that comes out of monetary policy is called the dot graph. And so every quarter, the Cleveland Federal Reserve publishes what is in essence a repeat of what the Federal Reserve puts in its minutes, which is a straw poll of the body that makes interest rate decisions and policy decisions generally in the United States, called the Federal Open Market Committee. Those blue dots are the individuals on that committee. And every quarter they're asked, where do you think interest rates should be at the end of this year, 2024, 2025, 2026, and what is sort of hand-wavily called the longer run. Now, that could be 2027. It could be this indeterminate time period out in the distance that just suggests that if markets work correctly, we'll go here. But the point is that you can see that these dots look like there's a fade over the next few years and then kind of finding some stability. Now, the point is, though, these dots are from June 2024. Okay, so in June, the opinion was by the end of this year, we'd be at about 5, maybe 5.25 on the Federal Reserve's rate, which is called the federal funds target rate, or what do you think of as the basically the rate at which banks lend to each other. Then the next year would be down about 1% and another percent in 2026, and then fading maybe another 0.5% sometime in the distant future. Well, this is the data, or these are the data from September. So as new data came to pass, and as the Federal Reserve actually changed rates, they felt like that they're actually going to start moving rates down more quickly. You can see that opinion in 2024 started to fade, and everything else sort of drifted down somewhat the same way. But notice that those dots are now not 1% away from each other the next couple of years. There's 1% more next year, and then not so much in 2026. Now that's September. Now, about 3.5 weeks ago, this one came out because the Federal Reserve had its final meeting. They made another interest rate cut. So you could see that even though they made an interest rate cut, and if you look at these dot graphs in history, usually when they've made a policy decision at the end of the year, all those dots are lined up on the same place because that's basically where you are. But some of these folks thought that that should not have happened. So you can see also these dots have gotten a lot closer together. So while this is a straw poll and much more of a narrative of where the Federal Reserve, where the Federal Open Market Committee members see the future, it is something to think about in terms of what has happened in the macroeconomy that suggests that interest rates are A, not going to fade as fast, or B, maybe the inflation issue is not cured enough to allow that fade in such a way that now I've got to be worried about prices rising, and that means maybe that we have not cured the problem. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to lower rates in such a way to overheat the economy again. So some of the games that central bankers play is we just don't know how much inflation is going to be a factor. That's absolutely critical in terms of where we go from here. Now, I'm going to show you a long history here of two interest rate ideas. The first one is the difference between the 10-year Treasury rate, or what our government pays for longer-term debt when they borrow, versus shorter-term debt, or the 3-month Treasury rate. Economists over the last 40 years or so have constantly watched yields, or the differences, what we call yield spreads, and tried to figure out which one is the most prescient of where we may be going in the macroeconomy. And these are monthly spreads from January 1982 to the end of December 2024. So you'll notice that as that blue line, which is that difference, starts to move towards zero, we creep closer to a shaded area, which is representative of recession. The reason that happens is because when these spreads go below zero, it basically makes it less profitable for a bank to lend, where these kind of represent the opportunity cost of lending the 10-year rate, borrowing deposits or gaining access to deposits and paying for them, the short-term rate. And when that spread goes below zero, it means it's costing me more to get $1 in than I'm going to earn by getting the $1 out the door as a lender. So that usually slows the economy down. We have what's kind of called a credit crunch, depending on what area you're from. And then we see a contraction in the economy because there's usually a slower movement of hiring after that. So you can see, at least from 1982 forward, that repeated itself over those next 3 recessions: in the Gulf War I in early 1990, in the dot-com recession in 2001 and 2, and in the Great Recession, that wider shaded area about 3/4 of the way moving left to right. Now, it just so happened that we also faded under that zero line before the pandemic recession, but then we had the anomaly of the pandemic, and you can't really say that that was a trigger. But notice where we've been. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to show you this in a minute. Notice on the far right-hand side that it's been below zero for some time. Now, it has crept up over the last 5 months, and there's 2 reasons behind that. One is the 10-year Treasury rate has faded initially, and then you saw the short-term rate based on the Federal Reserve actions really fade quickly. And then the 10-year rate started to pick up a little bit. So that pushed that blue line back above the zero line, which is in essence what the Federal Reserve is trying to do. And through this sort of melting pot of policy outcomes, can I cure the inflation problem? Can I reorient the spread environment to reduce the pressure on banking, to, in essence, unleash more liquidity into the economy? And then can I do that while still conserving most of the jobs in the economy? That is a rare event in modern monetary and economic history for emerged economies around the world. But the Federal Reserve rate, which is this black line, kind of tells the tale of when they've decided to fight inflation, fade the rate to try to re-stimulate the economy as we were going into recession. And you can almost see the business cycle of the economy over this 40+ year period through that black line. But notice on the far right-hand side, which I'm now going to shade, we've seen that fade from the plateau, and we've seen that blue line pick up. Historically, the blue line picking up while the fade takes place means that there's going to be some sort of rolling window in which job losses are coming, which will provide at least a little bit of recessionary pressure, because it was already boiling 9 or 12 months ago when that spread was below zero. I show you right off the top the jobs data, and that's why I show that right off the top, because unless that fades, we're not going into recession. So we might have what's called a soft landing in the sum of the parts. Now, this is the latest forecast out of what's called Fannie Mae. If you know that, that's the government-sponsored enterprise that actually buys what we call conforming mortgages from lenders and takes them off the market and buys them in the secondary market. They watch a lot of different rates. The blue line in this graph is the federal funds rate on a quarterly basis, or what the Federal Reserve sets. And you can see that their forecast in that green shaded area is for some fade, but not too quick over the next, let's say, 2 years. They took into account the recent cuts. This is the 10-year Treasury. Now, notice this one's gotten a little bit more flat. And we, like I said, it went down a little bit as we entered the third quarter of 2024, and then it picked up a little bit, and it's slowly sort of picking up. Now, the reason behind that is because inflation expectations have picked up a little bit. And the 10-year Treasury rate is a place in which most traders are looking to be compensated for changes in inflation expectations. And that's why that black line has picked up a little bit. Why that's important is because the black line, the 10-year Treasury, is usually the driver of what happens in 30-year fixed mortgage rates. So if you're thinking about the cost of a home and purchasing a home or refinancing, if that 10-year rate is not fading at a relatively good pace, or at least not a one in which you can expect it to fade, it will support a relatively high 30-year mortgage rate, and that'll keep the cost of getting a new home loan relatively high, not high in the last 40 years. And that's another thing. David and I could do a whole thing on that tonight alone. But the point is, it's going to keep it relatively high, which can lead to a little bit of stasis in housing markets. Okay. So the latest forecast, that's a consensus forecast that's out there, came in the sort of middle of the fourth quarter of 2024, just after the election, but not taking the election results into account because the data had not quite emerged yet post-election. But for the most part, what I'm going to walk you through are 3 data points that the Philadelphia Federal Reserve asks of 40 forecasters every quarter. And they say, hey, where do you think things are going? And in terms of the next few years, I pull 3 of those variables that they ask about, which is real GDP growth or income after inflation and the percentage change, the unemployment rate, and the same core PCE data we saw before. So that shaded area there is the latest forecast, or the quarter 3 data driven forecasts for the American economy for the next few years. The previous column to its left is what was true in quarter 2's data reported in quarter 3. So you see they got a little bit more optimistic about this year, or the year that just ended, and this year we're in now, a little bit more pessimistic for 2026, but not a lot of change. And if you're looking at those kind of growth data, there's really not a whole lot happening in your economy, sort of just trucking along easy peasy, with the idea that the next two, the unemployment rate, which is one somewhat flawed indicator, but an indicator of the labor market, is not changing that much, which suggests that the labor market is going to continue to provide productivity and gains. And as long as that's not undermined by rising inflation, that real GDP number, or the income you generate from work and investments, will continue to rise at a positive clip. So what that means in net is there's no recession right now. And if anything is sort of a deviation, it's a concern about inflation stabilizing in such a way that it's not going to continue to fall, which means growth might not get as much of an engine behind it over the next, let's say, 3 or 4 quarters. We will see. But right now, there's no forecasters out there that are suggesting, even with the election results, that we're going to have a recession very soon. And maybe at least not the next 2 years. After that, the fog for economists really starts to creep in. Also keep that in mind when you hear economists talking. Now, what can we expect from Trump economically? Well, the two big things are, one, is he going to try to push for some type of new tariff environment, whether those are actually new tariffs or augmented tariffs, and are they generalized or specific? So there's all kinds of possibilities here. But the point is that a tariff is a tax. It is paid by the consumer where the tax is assessed, but there is an idea called tax incidence, which then tells a story of who pays more of the tax. So the Trump administration is betting on the idea that when they set tariffs, the United States is in such a powerful position that they will be able to basically dictate what's going to happen with the economic flows after the tariff, that the economies that export to us will change their policies, change their pricing, change how unfair the administration believes they are in trade practices and an array of other items. So watch for a lot of talk around that, but there's going to be some price pressure once tariffs are changed, if they are changed in general, for sure, after January 20. The other thing is what's going to happen on our labor markets based on deportation, border policy, and the array of issues around immigration and emigration. You have to also think that from a small business standpoint, if we see people removed from our economy, the wages are going to rise to try to attract people in, especially if the economy still has a relatively decent amount of momentum inside of it. And that's another way in which inflation will indirectly make its way into our lives. So both of these have inflation inside of them. They also carry with them an enormous amount of social, economic, political uncertainty. So be thinking about that when you hear about these policies. We bear the price of the tariff. Okay, how much we bear of it at the end of the day when the markets play themselves out does depend on what we do in terms of looking at substitutes, but we are going to have to pay a price in the short term, just like if we see migration policy become relatively draconian in the way it's pursued. Now, what's that mean for the road ahead? The forecasts really haven't changed dramatically. There have been a few forecasts that have trickled out since since November 5, but not much. Not much change. And that's predicated upon the idea that the Trump administration generally will probably have a relatively pro-business stance when it's there. They do not want to see equity markets fade, housing markets fade, labor markets fade. They do want to have growth in the economy. Now, once the reality of some of these policies show their face, you may see some of the rhetoric lighten a little bit as well as the practice of it, but watch for that they don't necessarily want to go away from a pro-business stance. The labor market has some issues. We're seeing the number of job openings fade and the number of people quitting fade, which is also another harbinger of problems. So we're going to see how that goes over the next few weeks, over the next few quarters. But the financial markets are one place where I want to warn you, don't look at that as necessarily a gauge of where the economy is going. Think about it as where uncertainty is priced. So if you see stock markets fading very quickly, it's because they can't figure out what to do and they want to take profits off the table. If you see interest rates rising very quickly, it's because inflation expectations are rising in such a way that it's creating uncertainty, and I will not buy a bond unless the yield on it goes up and provides me more compensation against that risk. So our financial markets are where risk and uncertainty are priced, and the more that gets imputed, the weirder the financial markets become. And the geopolitical issues are still grinding along. Since November 5, basically, if you watch the news cycle, it has been nothing but Trump, and transition. We've got a lot of geopolitics or geopolitical issues out there that could easily rear their heads in much larger ways that might upset some of these forecasts and really kind of change the way that we look at the macroeconomy. So with that, I'm now going to hand it over to David to take us on the political journey. I just want to get David set up real quick, and off you go. Thanks so much, folks, for hearing all that, and then we'll be back for Q&A in just a bit. David, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Rob. Really appreciate that. And what I'd like to do is to start by looking at this outlook ahead. And, look, in the days since the 25th of last month, since Christmas, former President Carter has passed away. You've had an American-born and radicalized ISIS sympathizer kill 14 people celebrating New Year's Eve in Bourbon Street, New Orleans. Mike Johnson narrowly won the Speaker's gavel in the House of Representatives. And all of this was accompanied by a building frenzy in the GOP against President Biden's lame duck behavior. That began with the pardon of his son, Hunter. But this was followed 2 days before Christmas, or is included 2 days before Christmas, President Biden commuting the sentences of almost every federal inmate on death row. Last week, the president awarded former Representative Liz Cheney the Presidential Citizens Medal, and he honored Hillary Clinton and philanthropist George Soros with the Presidential Medals of Freedom. a move that might as well have been lab engineered, AI engineered for maximum MAGA meltdown. Then yesterday, we marked the 4th anniversary of January 6, 2021, the riot at the Capitol, as we watched the incoming 119th Congress and Vice President Harris certify Donald Trump's Electoral College victory. Yet former President Carter's passing at the age of 100 kind of prompted a wide range of reflections, a legacy, and a legacy that is unsurprising in some ways. His presidency is remembered mostly for a poor state of the U.S. economy and the 1970s energy crisis, right? Some of you will recall this. His most famous speech, widely billed as the Malaise speech, a speech that where he never actually uttered those words, the word of malaise. Yet he's also remembered fondly for humanitarian works of his post-presidency, including building homes for Habitat for Humanity and his campaign to eradicate guinea worm disease. But now as we pivot over the next 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks to the 47th president and the return of Donald Trump and his inauguration, it's important to kind of reflect on the changes of the Carter years and on the future directions in 2025 for American politics. Not only just how different American politics and society are today from Carter's time in office, yet also pathways forward for positive change amidst great upheaval and great uncertainty, as Rob alluded to. So tonight, we hope to provide you with not just some understanding about what is yet to come in the economic and politics sphere, but also some tools to navigate the seas ahead. And that's what we're going to do. And some of you may opine and look forward to, there's only 200 weeks until 2028 for those of us that do counting and quantitative stuff like Rob and I do. So let me kind of run through this a little bit for you. All right. So what we want to do tonight is look at the presidency and its transition process, what that looks like, what we know from the exit polls and the 2024 victory, and what conditions or expectations will affect the politics of transition in the next month or so from January 20th and then moving forward. So that's what we'll do here. Oops, sorry, it's taking me a moment here to advance the slides. Bear with me just 1 second. Okay. So the presidential election process in the United States is almost singularly unique amongst democracies, right? Most democratic governments move quickly, right? The United States does not. The new prime minister, for example, in the UK, takes office the morning after the election. We wait 2.5 months. So that places the ongoing administration, the Biden administration, at some odds, as Rob alluded to in his talk, with the dominance of the incoming administration, especially the dominance of a personality like Donald Trump. So as we look at the calendar, there's some important dates moving past January 20th that I want to point out to you. For example, John Thune, Senator Thune, the incoming leader, the new leader for Republicans in the U.S. Senate, has put forth a 5-day-a-week schedule in the U.S. Senate. It's hard for the U.S. Senate, for the U.S. Congress, the House, to be around for 3 days a week, but there's an ambitious schedule that's been put forward for 5 days a week. We've never seen anything like that. And part of that is the ambition of what they want to do, not just in the first 100 days, but what Susie Wiles, the incoming chief of staff for Donald Trump, has talked about the first 200 days, the first 300 days, and so on. All right, for the latest and greatest on appointments and updates, you can look at Politico, you can look at Washington Post, but it's really important if you want to see what's coming down the pike for potential appointments. This isn't Stephen Miller or Tom Homan in terms of dealing with the border. These are the people under them. And that is one thing that changes are those undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, those sub-cabinet level positions that really direct U.S. policy. And that's why you look at America First Policy or AmericaFirstPolicy.com team. That is Donald Trump's kind of think tank that's run. We paid a lot of attention in the election to Project 2025. That misses the boat because many of those issues in Project 2025 actually originate out of this think tank run out of Mar-a-Lago, and it is where the next set of appointments come from. So as Hegseth gathers up votes or others, RFK Jr. gather up votes for their upcoming committee hearings, their confirmation hearings, it's the people underneath them who they appoint as their counsel, who they appoint as their undersecretaries who will run day-to-day policy or run policy around so much of the United States government. They will come out of the America First Policy team. So that's an issue to pay attention to or a place to go to see what's coming forward for what comes next. All right. So if we look at what happened in the election, we had about 107 days of an election, spent about $1 billion. That the Harris team spent about $95 million a day. But while we might run a bunch of data and pay attention to a bunch of things, it's really an analysis to pay attention to just a couple of early indicators. Do you think the country's headed in the right or wrong direction? And what do presidential approval numbers look like? I've linked to those in the talk, so you can just click on that and what that looks like. And then you frame right and wrong direction and presidential approval by turnout. If you look just at those three components, the two components of right and wrong direction, presidential approval, and add turnout, you get kind of a top line analysis of what happened in the presidential election in November. And you see that turnout matters, you see that inflation matters, and that right and wrong direction is a pretty good barometer of what happens as early as June or July. By the time the election rolled around in early November, 1 out of 4 Americans thought the United States was headed in the right direction. About 20% of regular habitual voters thought the country was headed in the right direction. That makes it very difficult for the incumbent party or for Kamala Harris, regardless of her answer of what she would do differently than Joe Biden, to be successful in an election environment that looks like that. Furthermore, inflation is such an important element. And many of you know that we had a huge election in 2024. We had over 58 elections held and in 54 democracies. And every single democracy that held an election this last year, if inflation had risen in the last 12 months, every single ruling party lost, every single one. And in some of the after action reports and analysis involved in both talking to consultants on both the Democratic and Republican side, a lot of analysis was done. And one consultant noted that inflation is the human wrecking ball of democracies. When inflation is high, the party in power loses. Again, coming back to the economics that Rob talked about. And then there were some Democrats talking about, look, you have to speak better with those that shower after work as opposed to those showering before they go to work, and that there's a big difference here in terms of what was going on with both parties. But both parties face somewhat of an upheaval headed from 2024 into 2028, something that the Trump administration pays attention to. That is, if you kind of pan back here just for a second, in 2028, we have a super duper open primary system for both parties, both the successor to Trump and what MAGA movement looks like in 2028, and for who comes next in the Democratic Party. We are in the midst of this big change elections that go back and forth, but 2028 is really shaping up to be something unique in the modern era since, say, 1968, 1972 for the Democratic and Republican parties, respectively. All right. This has raised a fundamental question about where we're at today. Are we really in the midst of a dramatic racial realignment? In 2020, Donald Trump received 9% of the African American male vote, 9%. In this past election, based on the exit polls, we know that Donald Trump received 27% of the African American male vote. Again, not a big number, but a threefold increase in what we saw in 2020. If we start to then kind of slice and dice the electorate, we start to see things that are going on. We're seeing dramatic movement, not just with African American male voters, but also with Latino voters and Latina voters, that the non-white section of the electorate, which is increasing as a percentage of the regular electorate. Again, about 42% of the electorate this time out, still the majority of voters being older, whiter, and so on. But the electorate is shifting, especially as we head to 2028. And this is leading to some discussion about whether and where this great realignment, this racial realignment in American politics. There's great debate about this. It's something to watch moving forward and something for all of you to think about here as well. And you might recall the Call Her Daddy and the use of podcasts. And I just want to point to this changing elements of communication. You see that set there. The Harris campaign paid $100,000 to rebuild that set. That set stayed there, but out of their $1 billion budget, they rebuilt the set. They improved a lot of the digital components to it, the sound quality and audio and visual quality to what was going on, left it there, but it was part of her appearance there on Call Her Daddy. And you might recall she didn't appear on the Joe Rogan podcast. And just to place that in context, the Joe Rogan, sorry, one second here. The Joe Rogan podcast has about 33 million listeners. Uh, and that is equivalent or more listeners than what we see for MSNBC, for Fox, and CNN combined. So when the vice president doesn't go on Joe Rogan 4 weeks out from the election, that's hugely costly, not in terms of converting Joe Rogan listeners, but trying to reach one or 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4 Joe Rogan listeners for potential voters. That is what we are experiencing today, is what you might think of as the shards of glass election. So when we look here at the potential candidates who could run in 2028, in whatever guise that is, if that's Matt Gaetz for Florida governor, if that's Nikki Haley returning, or Mayor Pete, or even California's own Governor Gavin Newsom or Kamala Harris deciding to run again. If you look at that, you have to pay attention to what's known as this shards of glass version of the media, like a shattered windshield, how the media is handling information, what's going on with our students, how they're handling information and receiving information. All of us, the opportunity for podcasts, YouTube, the fracturing of the media message is providing some big challenges. This is not the only reason you see MSNBC up for sale, but even if you look at Fox viewership and what's happening with the mainstream media in terms of Fox viewership and cable news networks, all declining rapidly into numbers that are into the hundreds of thousands, with the exception of Fox, but closer to 1 or 2 million than where they've been in the past. This is going to fundamentally revise and alter how you run for office and how you communicate. And that's going to be an important element kind of moving forward. So that presents, I think, some additional kind of conversations and discussions we might want to have to pay attention to misinformation or disinformation, or how people are providing and learning about what's going on, especially in this great time of upheaval. So let me leave it there, Rob, and so we can get some questions in from our audience.
Oh, wow.
And again, it's all nice. That's nice to see you all here as well.
David, outstanding. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I think to start off with, what I want to ask you is, what do you expect in 2026? So, I mean, while 2028 is coming, it seems like that 2026 maybe would be also a very pivotal year. But I'm an economist, not a political scientist. I'd love to hear your take on how important or non-important 2026 is at this juncture.
Okay, so let's play this a couple of different ways. One is, if you think about California and what's happening in California, the governor started introducing elements of his budget yesterday. He'll continue to do so, leading to the introduction of the full budget later this week. California appears to have been pulled back from the abyss. So as he's designing a budget, he's looking past 2026 when he is termed out, and looking forward, obviously, to what could happen potentially in 2028. But the reason the focus is important on California is more than half of the state legislature terms out in 2026. So that means someone like Sonoma State's own and Senate Pro Tem Mike McGuire, Senator McGuire is out of the Senate. Bill Dodd already left, but Jim Wood has already left, but we see others who are leaving. And that changes and has a lot of upheaval within Sacramento. So the 2026 election, for coordinating what's happening in California, where we saw gains and pickups because of a decline in Democratic turnout in the state, and we saw some pickup in certain districts in California by Republicans. It's going to put Republicans in some places to be a slightly more competitive at the sub-state level. So like in assembly races and county supervisorial races, even though they are nonpartisan. So you're going to see kind of a different kind of emboldened party. And the reason that's important is because each party is still kind of in disarray. Democrats in disarray, Republicans in disarray about who takes over for Trump coming next. So that gives you a very tight timeline. That's probably a little more than 100 days, but into a period of, I can just share my screen here for a second. Hold on just a second.
David, what we're going to do. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Yeah, let me see.
Yeah, I was going to say, let me stop the share. Okay, you're good now. Cool.
Okay,
You should be able to share.
I just want to show this quick element here.
Totally.
Here is the Senate schedule for what's going on. Those yellow days are what's moving forward. But look at what happens at the end of March into April. The 29th of April is that 100-day mark. for the Trump presidency, 47, Trump 2.0. But it also puts a lot of work into what is going on later in the year with the August recess. This is a pretty ambitious schedule, and just as a reminder for everyone here, you don't have just one Freedom Caucus on the. Sorry, let me stop this on the on the House side. You have four Freedom Caucuses. So when you look at what's going on in the U.S. Senate for Thune's schedule, a lot of this is the Senate and the House are not on the same page, and that's going to be an important element headed past that April timeframe into what can be done by the Trump administration.
So, David, a question came in, and folks, two things. One is that we had some questions come in before from registrants as they signed up for this webinar, and we also have some folks putting in the Q&A. So I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit with David, and then I'll jump in with a few questions that were asked about the economy in just a second. But I think a kind of a compelling question came in here, Dave, is that what do you think about what we're hearing in terms of rhetoric with respect to things like Greenland, Panama, Canada, in the sense that if we think about because when we were at home and we're talking about this, I'm thinking, I don't think that Trump necessarily wants to get afoul of our classic allies.
Yeah.
But for Greenland, Panama, Canada, I mean, how do you reconcile that politically?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple things here. I think as the viewers will remember, Donald Trump 1.0 was pretty chaotic. It was up and down. You didn't know what ideas were going to fly out. It's a different set of individuals this time, largely, but he's still going to have this kind of fire from the hip, fire from the lips presidency. And so you're going to see things about, taking over possibly with military control Panama, if that's what we need to do, taking over the Canadians so we have their beer so they can't do these things anymore to threaten the Russian River Brewery or Lagunitas. But these ideas have no legs in the Senate first and in the House, even though a lot of the House has laid down and let Donald Trump walk all over them. So they're going to continue to be these kind of pontifications. But I think it does go to the broader point. And I just want to remind people of this because you brought it up at the end of your talk, and that is the global conflict environment. In the last couple of months, the government of Germany has fallen, France, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary is teetering. There's a lot going on around Ukraine that affects NATO's future. And it's the lack of certainty. It's the uncertainty of Donald Trump when he talks about these ideas that threatens our allies. And that becomes a huge, important component for where the Chinese government can fill into what's going on. It can upset global trade patterns. And just to place this in context, if you're looking at tariffs, the global trade problem just with China is about a $1 trillion global kind of process. So if you're going to do things related to tariffs to get a better deal with the Chinese, you're going to target things like consumer tech, like what's at Best Buy. That's where you're going to go, as opposed
100%.
to other elements. And that's the kind of thing where if he's talking about those things, he's being more serious than kind of shooting from the hip about trying to take over Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark.
Yeah, and so we had a question that come in from the pre-registration that was kind of a good tie to that, is that what are the chances the supply chains will be disrupted by the next administration or during its time? And from an economic standpoint, and David alluded to this, that how tariffs are set, really, they're kind of trying to do two things at once. One, they're trying to reorient the consumer toward a domestic substitute, if in fact it exists, and that's the big question. The second part is it's trying to, and this is a little bit more indirect, potentially draw in investment to take advantage of a market where you could actually come in at a lower price because the protection is there and come in and begin to compete. So at like 10,000 feet, that's normally what we think about when we think about protectionist policies like tariffs and how they might reorient markets. But with that said, from a supply chain standpoint, it probably won't necessarily disrupt the supply chain. It probably will make it more expensive. So if what that will do is it will disrupt supply chains down the line in the sense of how many homes will be produced, how many new iPhones will be purchased, what that means for car manufacturing and the cost of cars, especially just coming out of a high interest rate environment. Auto dealers, you may notice, are starting to show more and more deals than they did when we had a lower interest rate environment. They're starting to sort of play a game with moving inventory. The cost of a car if tariffs are assessed in a more general fashion, will also start to rise. And if it's in a specific fashion, to David's point on the consumer tech side, that will also have a reverbative effect in terms of more durable purchases, if you want to see it that way, whether it be homes, cars, appliances. Those things will inch up based on the want to move that cost to the consumer. So I would not say there'd be a supply chain disruption that would come from, let's say, administrative decisions per se, but it would probably be a byproduct in terms of cost. The one way you can think about the supply chain disruption, though, is what happens with the labor force. So if you don't have as many dock workers because they're drawn to something else because wages have gone up, or you just simply don't have as many people working on sites that in fact are undocumented but are working, that can also change the way that goods move from one place to another. So keep all that in mind as you start to see these policies emerge. At least that's in my mind with respect to supply chains.
Rob, I just want to add one component to this, and that is if you're looking at sectors in the United States that the Trump administration will concentrate on, one of those places is juicing AI infrastructure. So data centers, chip manufacturing, new energy sources. Those are things that the Trump administration is going to concentrate on because they think they provide higher paying jobs that resist and can provide higher than expected earnings, if you will, that can move through some of this period. It's a different type of investment in the United States. It's a supply side investment, industrial policy, as opposed to the investment side or how the Biden administration has handled this. That's a very different approach. And the key official, I think, that telegraphed this is Trump appointed Stephen Miran, Miran, to be his chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And Miran has written a lot about supply side manufacturing investment, particularly AI. So AI infrastructure investment, I think, is going to be something they're going to press hard over these next 2 years headed into 2026.
Totally. Agreed. And it'll be very intriguing to watch how much they're actually able to pull off without a disruption. That to me is the big sort of elephant in the room is what can you do to sort of take on the promises of the campaign trail and not disrupt the situation you're most trying to preserve, because you need that in 2026 and ultimately in 2028. There's a couple of questions that came in on the economic side in terms of about the economics of the wine industry, for example. The economics of the wine industry have gotten a lot weirder in the last year. Things we, in some cases, haven't seen where contracts are refused 2 or 3 months before the fruit's moving, and really kind of almost recognizing that there might be a shift that is structural, not necessarily away from wine, but maybe even away from alcohol. And it'll be intriguing to watch what happens, especially if we have some change in labor markets in such a way that it costs more to produce because we don't have as many workers available. And that's kind of the dirty secret we have, is we have a lot of undocumented people who work in agriculture, who work in restaurants, who support tourism. Sonoma, Napa, Marin, Solano, San Francisco counties. If there's a shock in that space in the labor market, it's going to change the dynamics of those markets and the folks that hire those workers for sure in terms of their cost structure. So that could also affect how much is produced and really how competitive you can be in terms of marketing and trying to get out in front of people if you have to reorient your cost to something else. The wine industry is going through a shift. How much of it is perception, how much of it is reality is still emerging, but I think we have to take it seriously for sure. I was a lot more optimistic 18 months ago, even though we started to hear things. Last year was very scary in terms of some of the decision making that we saw and is likely to be made again over the next couple of years. David, we had another question come in that said, given the hyperpartisan nature of our politics, is the bargaining position aspect of Trump's policy statements being given adequate weight, or are these positions being used primarily to sort of, can you believe what this guy said, in the sense that, is it more like for clicks, or is it actually, real?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two components to this. One is this idea of putting a massive reconciliation bill together, something that deals with the farm bill, that deals with subsidies, that deals with tariffs, that deals with his tax cuts, and what all into one big bill. Doesn't recognize the true legislative kind of landscape. So his rhetoric is a place where I think we can kind of set that aside for a certain degree. It is important how Elon Musk talked about what was going on in terms of the speaker vote, in terms of funding the government, in terms of the debt limit. That was just as important for what Trump was saying. And here's why. There's a 219 to 215 difference between the GOP and the Democrats in the House. That gives really Speaker Johnson kind of one vote. That's all he can afford to lose. And that closeness is historic. And it's historic because the Senate is 53-47. The Senate is actually a bigger gap than the House in terms of the two-party kind of balance. That's really unusual. If you think of that and then combine that with 4 Freedom Caucuses, a Liberty Caucus, a Freedom and Liberty Caucus, a Liberty Bell Caucus, all these strictures, kind of components of what is going on the Freedom Caucus, it means that the Republicans are not whole. And that's a real challenge moving forward. And if the president does too much to upset that, he's not able to rally people around. And I think where that becomes hugely important is how an immigration fight or what happens around border security affects the U.S. economy and destroys. They're not concerned about blue areas and blue counties, but may destroy some emerging industries in states where they expanded their vote. And that's an element where his rhetoric could be harmful to them moving forward, headed into that 2026 period when he's not able to get legislation passed.
So, David, to that point, we have a few minutes left, folks. So I'm going to try to move a little bit more quickly through some of your questions. How do you expect the appointments to hold, and what percentage of what's sort of out there with let's say, the cabinet level? Because to your point, there's this array of other people below the cabinet level positions. But what percentage of the cabinet level positions do you think are actually going to stick?
All right. So again, it's paying attention to deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, and assistant secretaries. That's where policy is made. That's the key element of where things are happening in terms of implementation. So those appointments are coming out of America First policy team. That's where you want to kind of put your focus as you scatter and move through your news feeds. In addition to that, when you look at what's happening with appointments, as of today, it looks like Pete Hegseth has enough votes to move forward out of his committee hearing onto the floor of the Senate. Again, 53 Republicans in the Senate, obviously 60 votes needed relative to debate and cloture in the U.S. Senate. And John Thune is no friend. He's no MAGA guy. He's not a friend of Donald Trump. He endorsed him this last election, but asked for him to get out of the race in 2016. So he's had an on and off relationship with Donald Trump, but he announced Pete Hegseth has enough votes. That moves the focus then to someone like Kash Patel or Tulsi Gabbard. Those are 2 appointments that one of them may be sacrificed and to move forward to get the other 2, whether that's Tulsi Gabbard as the player to be named later, or whether that's Kash Patel as the player to be named later. That's something to watch. But as of today, before we've even had any hearings, it looks like Pete Hegseth today has enough Republican votes to move forward out of committee to at least get to the floor.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, David. That's super. I had a question come in about the climate change and how it plays into some of the forecasts. It actually really does not yet. Climate change has been really kind of a bizarre phenomenon in terms of how to put your arms around it from a macroeconomic standpoint, and when you should start to think about imputing more risk into forecasts resulting from climate change. At this point, the forecasts that I know of really are not, and whenever I do a forecast, I'm not thinking, do I need a little climate parameter that I can kind of lever around it to shake things up? Because I think this is actually going to be a little bit more detrimental. It's in those longer term bond markets where you usually will see that kind of action start to show its face. On the more positive side, the one thing where I'm hoping we see some action and where Elon Musk being in the sort of inner circle might lead to some change would be to look at climate change technology as a highly profitable way for the U.S. to do things like they did in the 1990s in terms of technology and be on the forefront of that. Now, it will be much more speedy in terms of its movement out into the world and the utilization of global labor markets to generate those goods and services over time. But that might start to emerge under the right scenario. However, we've had a lot of drill baby drill rhetoric, a lot of old school energy politics that have popped up. So we might see a little bit more risk pop into forecasts simply because the supposition is we're accelerating that change because of the change in policy where we were with the Biden administration. The last question, David, this is more like a lightning round. What's a good reason for you to be hopeful?
A good reason to be hopeful is that there's a lot of alternative news sources out there on Substack that are providing opportunities moving forward. If you look at the work of Nina Jankowicz and an SSU grad, Ben Schultz at the American Sunlight Project and what they're doing, very hopeful. There are resources out there like Information Laundromat, as well as NewsGuard. There are places to go and on Substack to provide alternatives to what's going on with this fracturing or shards of glass kind of idea of the media. It's an exciting time. It is an important moment for change. We're at this big inflection moment of demographic shift and demographic change, not just at the university, not just in our region, but also, if you will, writ large in American politics. And that affects obviously our economics, our society, and the political situation as well.
Yeah, and I agree. And the other thing too, folks, on the economic side is that, economies want to grow. They do not want to recess. And when they start to recess, it means there's a problem in the economy that someone has created or something has finally shown its face that for some reason we didn't quite see the correct indicators, a la what we've had in the global financial crisis / Great Recession. Those are kind of rarities. Normally, economies recess because of a natural coming to an end of a cycle and then trying to push it a little further and then finally biting the bullet. That'll be the real challenge of the Trump administration in terms of, can they utilize the momentum that's been built by the Biden administration and actually ride that wave in a way where they're able to continue that growth, even though there's going to be some policies that should be a little bit slower for the economy. We have to be thinking that economies want to grow, and the Trump administration does not have a large incentive to upset that growth if it suddenly starts to show its face. The hope is that it happens under, let's say, more rational auspices than simply doing mass deportations, generalized tariffs, and assuming that everything is just going to work itself out okay politically, socially, and economically. So those are some things that I've been thinking about too. Folks, thank you so much for making your time to come out tonight. And I want to thank Alumni Association. I want to thank Mario for starting us off, and Advancement for making this happen. I want to thank Dave for his time and his expertise. I hope you felt I was an expert at some points tonight too. But with all that said, folks, thank you so much. And we'll see you soon. We intend to do some of this over time, so watch for it, especially if you're an alum.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Rob.
Take care.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.